The letter gave me 10 days to erase my sister. That's not how the paper put it, of course. It was official logo at the top, important violation notice in bold, and a block of text that read like the aftermath of a printer losing a fight with a thesaurus. But the sentence that mattered was plain. Remove unauthorized plantings immediately. The plantings were 6 sunflowers I tucked into the dusty strip by my front steps. A little flare of gold that caught morning light and my breath at the same time. I'd planted them 2 months after moving to Mesa, Arizona. New job, new townhome, new heat that felt like a hair dryer to the face because I needed something that didn't ask for anything back except water. My sister, Lila, and I had grown sunflowers every summer in the small square of dirt behind our row house in New Jersey. We'd measure ourselves against the stalks, committing our heights to pencil marks on the doorframe and our ambition to how tall we thought we could get. She died 3 years ago. Some losses feel like somebody turned the volume down on the world and left it that way. The sunflowers were me, trying to turn it up. I stood on my porch, barefoot, letter in hand, watching a bee bumble from one yellow face to the next. I'd seen HOA in the listing when I bought the place. Homeowners Association, some line item with dues and vague promises of community maintenance. I'd pictured something like a friendly book club that also bought new pool chairs. Not this. I read the letter again. It included a $75 fine and a warning about further penalties up to and including lien and foreclosure. I laughed on an exhale, one of those bewildered, brittle laughs that feels like it might hiss into a sob if you're not careful. Then I went inside, set the paper on the counter, and called the number on the letter. A woman answered with a voice like polished stone. Desert Ridge Management. This is Courtney. Hi, this is Maya Patel. I got a violation letter about some sunflowers. This must be a mistake. Oh no, Ms. Patel, she said, brightly efficient. Per the cc&rs, all front landscaping must conform to the approved palette. Sunflowers are not on the approved list. The what? The covenants, conditions, and restrictions. She made it sound like a catechism. You should have received them at closing. I looked at the folder my realtor had called all the things, a fat brick of papers I'd shoved into a desk drawer. Right, I said. Okay, but they're flowers. They're not hurting anyone. I totally understand, she said, as if sympathy counted. But the rules keep the community uniform. You have 10 days to remove them. Is there an appeal? I asked. You can attend the next board meeting, she said, but the fine will accrue until the violation is corrected. What does that mean? Accrue. $25 per day. I hung up and pressed my fingers into the countertop until my knuckles went white. $25 per day. For flowers. For Lila. My throat went tight. I thought about just ripping them up. 15 minutes, 3 garbage bags, $50 of regret at Home Depot later done. It would be cheaper, easier. It also felt like putting a hand over my mouth and whispering, don't make a scene. That night I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, and the neighbor across the cul-de-sac wandered over. He was in his 60s, tanned into leather, ball cap, a faded Arizona Cardinals t-shirt that had seen better seasons. You're the new one, he said, nodding at the house. I'm Lou. Used to be a firefighter. Now I'm the neighborhood gossip if you believe certain people. He jerked his chin toward a house down the block, beige like mine, with a front yard of gravel raked into lines like a Zen garden. Hi, I said. Maya. He glanced at the letter on the table. They got you. Apparently, I'm a menace to uniformity, I said. My sunflowers are outlaw flora. Lou snorted. Nancy hates color, unless it's hers. She's the HOA president. Of course she is, I said, and the next morning, I learned exactly what that meant. She showed up at 9, right when the sun started to glare off every surface like the neighborhood had been She didn't knock. She stood on my walk, hands on hips, sunglasses the size of saucers, and called my name. I came out and shaded my eyes with my hand. I'm Nancy Delaney, she announced, like a senator, HOA president. We need to discuss your violation. Good morning, I said. Would you like some water? I'm fine, she said in the voice of someone for whom thirst is a weakness. Those wildflowers need to be removed by Friday. They're not wildflowers, I said. They're sunflowers, and they're in the strip by the steps, not the community landscaping. Common area, she said. The association is responsible for maintaining the street-facing beds. You don't get to make unilateral changes. I didn't know, I said. Then, because I couldn't help it, and also, they're pretty. This is a community, she said, and I swear, she capitalized it. We can't have people doing whatever they want. That's how neighborhoods go downhill. She leaned closer. Under the perfume and the powder, I smelled something like vinegar. I'm sure you're very nice, Maya. But we have rules for a reason. I thought of Lila, sunburned shoulders and dirt under her nails, grinning in August heat. And what's the reason for telling someone they can't grow flowers? Nancy's mouth pinched. Uniformity. Uniformity, I repeated. It tasted like chalk. She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. Looking forward to seeing you at the board meeting next Thursday, 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. In the meantime, take them out and we'll waive half the fine. I said I'd think about it. She left me with the weight of the word lean, heavy in the air. I went to work and tried to focus on Python scripts and the new feature my team was sprinting to demo. But the word kept tapping me on the shoulder like an impatient child. Lean, foreclosure, for flowers. By lunch, I had a tension headache and a decision. I wasn't ripping them out. Not yet. I'd go to the meeting. I'd make my case. I'd bring a picture of Leela, if I had to. I spent that night with the cc&rs, a binder that smelled faintly of toner and doom. It was a maze of clauses and subclauses, rules about everything from holiday lights, white only, no inflatables, to permitted wreath diameters, 20 inches or smaller. Hidden deep in there was the answer to a question I hadn't thought to ask. When was the last election? Board members served 2-year terms, staggered, blah blah. The current board Nancy and 2 men named Gary and Jeb had been appointed after the developer turned over control. That was 5 years ago. They haven't had a real election, Lou said the next day when I asked. They just slide new names onto the website and call it good. They keep canceling meetings if people show up and ask too many questions. Can they do that? He grinned without humor. They do. I showed up to the meeting with a knot in my stomach and a zip folder of papers like a student ready to present a project. The clubhouse was colder than the inside of a freezer, the air conditioning set to prove a point. There were rows of plastic chairs. 10 people sat scattered like they'd been poured into the room and had settled where they landed. At the front, a folding table held Nancy, a guy with a sunburnt scalp and a tie Gary, and a man with eyebrows like sleeping caterpillars Jeb. To one side sat a woman with a laptop and the blank-eyed resilience of service workers everywhere. Courtney, management. Nancy smiled like a teacher whose patience was already thin. Call to order, she said, tapped a gavel at the table, and launched into an agenda that included a landscaping contract, pool hours, and near the bottom, new business. When she asked for homeowner comments, I raised my hand. She looked past me like I was a smudge on a window. New business, she said, tapping the gavel. First item, solar shading options for the playground. I stood. Excuse me, I said, politely as I could. I have a violation notice I'd like to appeal. A few people turned. Courtney typed without looking up. Nancy sighed. Ma'am, homeowner comments are at the end. We have a lot to cover. I sat, flushed. They talked about shade sales for 20 minutes, and then picnic table replacements for 10, and then a discussion about whether the pool gate needed a new lock fob system. It did for another 15. 40 minutes in, Nancy closed the laptop and said, meeting adjourned. Wait, I said, standing so quickly my chair scraped. Homeowner comments. Nancy tapped the gavel again. We had an emergency item we'll handle in executive session. Thank you all for coming. People began to stand in that slow, defeated way I recognized from every underfunded town meeting I'd ever watched on YouTube. Lou, sitting 2 rows ahead, tilted his head at me, apology written in his shrug. I walked to the front anyway. I have 10 days to remove my flowers, I said, keeping my voice steady by sheer force. You canceled homeowner comments. I need to talk about it. Nancy looked bored. Gary avoided my eyes. Jeb inspected his nails. We can't discuss individual violations in open session, Nancy said. Privacy. They're my flowers. I said. It's my privacy. That's not how it works, she said. Courtney can schedule you for a hearing. Courtney, caught like a fish in the line between us, said. We can fit you into next month. Next month, I repeated. Gary stood, tucking his tie into his shirt. Those sunflowers are quite tall, he ventured, voice timid. They sort of clash. I walked home in the purple dusk feeling like I was 5 years old and had been told to sit down and wait my turn while the adults handled things that would never, ever include me. The air smelled like creosote and disappointment. I sat on the steps by the flowers and pressed my palms into my eyes until stars burst behind my lids. Something inside me, the part that had curled around its losses and cried itself to sleep when no one was watching, uncurled. I didn't want to fight. I never wanted to fight. But if one had already been brought to my doorstep, I could at least stop letting people stick their fingers in my chest and say, that's just how it is. The next day, I knocked on doors. I started with Lou, who said, "You're either very brave or very bored." Then I went to the single dad at the corner, who always had a toddler riding a tricycle on the sidewalk, Marcus, tired eyes, quick grin, and the nurse who worked nights and hung her scrubs on a line. Even though there was a strict rule about lines, they ticketed me for the scrubs, she said, rolling her eyes. I mean, come on. And the older woman with the immaculate succulence who made me take a foil-wrapped slice of banana bread, while she told me about the time the HOA tried to make her repaint her front door because the paint was too glossy, under direct sun. By the end of the day, I had a list of 20 names and a phone full of numbers. People who had been fined for faded house numbers, for a trash can visible for 10 minutes on a Tuesday, for a non-compliant wreath in November. I had a night shift nurse willing to show up if someone texted her 30 minutes before. A high school art teacher who had redesigned the community logo for free, only for Nancy to hire a professional for $10,000. And Lou, who had that friendly glint in his eye that said he'd light a fuse if you handed him one. I also had something else, curiosity, specifically, about that $10,000 logo and who the professional had been. The next week, I sent Courtney an email requesting financial records, budgets, contracts, invoices, the minutes of the last year's meetings. I'd Googled enough to know that most states require HOAs to keep this stuff and show it to members on request. I kept it breezy. Hi Courtney, thanks again for your help. I'd like to review the association's records at your convenience. She replied 2 days later with a PDF that was spottier than a teenager's first attempt at shaving. The minutes were vague, discussion ensued, the budgets were general, and there were no contracts attached. I wrote back, polite, "So sorry to be a hassle. Could I get the landscaping and logo contracts?" She told me I'd need to pay for copies and give 30 days notice. That night, Lou said, "Desert Ridge is in Nancy's pocket." "You say that like it's a fact," I said. He shrugged. "They've had the management contract for 6 years. Every time someone else bids, it gets tabled for further research and then it vanishes." I requested the records again and got another insurance policy against transparency. So I made a spreadsheet. I typed in the budget line items, the payment amounts from the ledger Courtney finally sent after I said I'd happily pay the copy fee, and the names of payees. Some of them were normal, boring, HOA fare. Some were less boring. Sun Trails Services $48 pool resurfacing cactus, Crown Landscaping, $96,000 annual, maintenance, Design Co., $10,000, logo rebranding. Stared at that last one and felt the first spark catch, Delaney. It wasn't a common enough name to ignore. I looked up Delaney Design Co. in the state's business database, public information, registered agent, Patricia Delaney, address, a P.O. box, email, DelaneyDesignCo@gmail.com. Clicked from that tab to Facebook and typed Delaney Mesa. A picture popped up. Nancy, arm tucked around a woman at a gala, both of them in glittery black. The caption, "Sisters Night Out." I sat back in my chair. Okay, it could be a coincidence. Sisters can each have their own businesses. Maybe Nancy recused herself. Maybe it was all above board. Then I Googled Cactus Crown Landscaping. The second result was a local news article about small businesses surviving the pandemic. It quoted a man named Brian Delaney, proud new owner of Cactus Crown, who had taken over from a retiring owner in 2020. I closed my eyes and laughed. It wasn't funny, but sometimes the universe lays the pieces out like you're in kindergarten and puts the picture on the box. By the time the next meeting rolled around, I had a packet, not a binder. Binders are how you show up to lose civilly. A stack of paper with sticky notes that said things like page for logo and landscaping bid. I also had a plan that wasn't really a plan so much as a promise. I wasn't going to let them gavel me into silence again. The clubhouse was full, which I'd like to say was all me, but was probably also Nancy herself. She'd sent out an email about escalating harassment from certain members and how civility would be enforced. People tend to show up when they sense there will be theater. I was early, and so was she. We stood outside in the heat, desert, mountains like corduroy in the distance. You've been very busy, she said. Her smile had teeth in it. I read the documents, I said. You should try it sometime. It was petty and it was true, and it slid out before I could edit it. Her eyes flickered. You should be careful, she said softly. HOA fines are not a joke. You wouldn't be the first to underestimate what they can do. I thought for a second that she meant she would personally ruin me. Then I understood she meant the machinery. The system that grinds and grinds because it has rules, about the rules, and no incentive to stop. I also thought about how systems have cracks, and how sometimes people like Nancy mistake cracks for their own power. The meeting began with her reading a statement on conduct that sounded like it had been copied from a kindergarten classroom wall. Use kind words, Nancy intoned, no personal attacks. She looked at me when she said that, ironically. When it was time for homeowner comments, I raised my hand and stood at the same time, elbowing courage into the room with my body. I have a violation I want to discuss, I said. But before that, I have questions about the association's finances. A murmur. People wake up at the word money, like you pulled a fire alarm. Nancy breathed in through her nose. Finances are not part of homeowner comments. Then make them part of the agenda, I said. We elect you to be stewards of community funds. You don't elect us, Gary said, then blanched, like he'd said it out loud when he meant to think it. Right, I said. That's part of the problem. When was the last election? That's irrelevant, Nancy said. We operate within the bylaws. I held up the packet. Do the bylaws say it's okay to award a contract to your sister's company? She blinked. The room hummed. You're making baseless accusations, she said. Are you or are you not related to the owner of Delaney Design Co.? I asked. Jeb shifted in his chair. Gary's tie seemed to tighten by itself. Nancy said, I refuse to dignify. She is, someone said from the back. They're on Facebook together all the time. Facebook isn't evidence, Nancy snapped. You're right, I said, and held up the printout from the business registry. But public records are, she stilled, and I took that as permission to keep going. Cactus Crown Landscaping, owned by Brian Delaney. Any relation? No answer. The silence had a slither to it, like a reptile. Because I also have the bid from Desert Bloom Landscaping from last year, I said, tapping another paper. They bid $58,000 for the same work. Cactus Crown charges $96,000. Nancy found her voice. We hired the best, not the cheapest. We are under no obligation to choose the lowest bidder. Are you under an obligation to disclose conflicts of interest? I asked. Courtney finally looked up from her laptop. Her fingers paused above the keys. You're out of line, Nancy said. So is threatening leans over flowers while funneling contracts to family. Lou called out. He'd taken a seat near the front. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. Remove him, Nancy told Courtney. Courtney looked at her like she'd asked for her to pick up a house and move it. I can't remove him, she whispered, very audible. He's sitting, then call security. We don't have security, Courtney said. A man in the second row raised his hand. I'm a lawyer, he said. He looked like he might actually be a lawyer, which is to say, he was wearing a shirt that had been ironed. The law requires open meetings and record access. If you don't want to answer questions, you can adjourn, but that will not make the questions go away. Nancy adjusted her glasses with a hand that trembled, almost imperceptibly. Then she smiled, and it made me feel good in the way a thunder feels good when you live somewhere that needs rain, because people like Nancy wear their smiles like armor. A crack means something. Fine, she said. We will schedule an audit. You'll schedule an audit, I repeated. Yes, she said sweetly. Our management company will retain an independent auditor. In the meantime, Ms. Patel, if you remove your sunflowers, we will waive your fine. No, I said. If you're so worried about uniformity, enforce it fairly. Hold an election, and yes, schedule an audit. But independent will mean independent. The lawyer stood. I'll volunteer for a committee, he said. The bylaws provide for committees, do they? Nancy asked. Her voice was flat as a cutting board. They do, he said, and he had a copy of the cc&rs in his hand and a flag of sticky notes slapping in the air as he waved it. The meeting dissolved into mutters and shuffling feet and the kind of messy democracy that is at once embarrassing and the only thing that works. Nancy adjourned it with a gavel and a glare, but the damage was done. The room had heard the numbers. They had smelled smoke. They were going to look for fire. For the next 3 weeks, my phone was my life. I created a neighborhood group chat. We knocked on doors again, this time with clipboards and pens. We explained to retirees and renters who didn't technically vote but lived with the consequences what a recall was. It's like you get to hit Control Z, Marcus said, and that made enough sense for people to sign. We needed a majority of homeowners. We got to -thirds. Meanwhile, Desert Ridge Management sent me 3 more violation letters, one for a visible bicycle Marcus's kid, front yard, 10 minutes, one for trash can placement, Lou's son had taken it out too early, and one for my sunflowers again, with an increased per-day fine. The tone got uglier as the amounts got higher, which is probably the least surprising sentence on earth. You scared them, Lou said, sipping coffee on my porch as the morning sun edged over the roofline. We watched a hummingbird dive and swerve like a tiny fighter jet. Scared animals get mean. I'm scared, I said. He nodded. That's because you're sane. We filed the recall petition with Desert Ridge and gave notice for a special meeting. Nancy sent her own email with a subject line that said, "Don't let bullies take over our community." She called us a fringe group and said we were endangering property values. Someone printed it out and slid it under my door like a threatening Valentine. I took a picture and texted it to the group with just the caption, LOL, the night of the recall. The clubhouse was standing room. Only you could feel the room heat from body temperature. The way a winter cabin warms up as more people come in and shrug off their coats. I had my packet. The lawyer, whose name turned out to be Evan, had a copy of Robert's Rules of Order in a blue cover that had seen some things. Marcus had brought a camera. Public meeting, he said cheerfully, and set it on a tripod near the Bach. Nancy opened with her usual gavel and a speech about members of our community who don't respect authority. When it was time to present the recall petition, she said, "Improper notice," and tried to skip it. Evan stood up and read the relevant section from the bylaws like he was giving a bedtime story to a particularly stubborn toddler. Nancy tried again. "Security will remove disruptive members," she said, and we all turned to look at the empty space where security would have been. She glared, then sighed like the weight of a city was on her shoulders. There are moments you can feel, as they happen, like a click, like a lock turning. Evan called for a vote. People lined up. They wrote their names. They deposited slips into a plastic bin that had once held pretzels. Courtney counted under the flicker of old fluorescent lights. Then she counted again. Then, she whispered to Nancy. "No," Nancy said, too loud. "No, no, no." Courtney straightened. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had spent too many years being polite to bullies. "The recall passes," she said. The room didn't explode. It sighed. People clapped. Lou grinned at me and I tried to memorize the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. Nancy stood very still. Then she did something I didn't expect. She cried. She turned away from the room, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and walked out, her shoes clicking against the tile with a finality that sounded like a door closing. By the end of the week, we had a temporary board, me, Evan, a woman named Jess who runs the night shift at the hospital and whose calm would steady a ship, and an accountant named Yvonne who radiated competence like heat. Desert Ridge sent an email that was a masterpiece of strategic distance. "We look forward to working with the new board." We requested the records. All of them. It took a subpoena war, the HOA version, stern letters, more stern letters, and the threat of an attorney general complaint, but they arrived. Bankers' boxes full of receipts, minutes, bids, invoices, and what looked like the world's most depressing scrapbook of checks. We sat around a folding table in the clubhouse and sorted. The first night, I found the pool resurfacing invoice, $48,000 to Sun Trails Services, addressed the same P.O. box as Delaney. Design Co. Yvonne found a check written to a roof repair company that turned out to have the same registered agent as Nancy's. Cousin Evan found minutes from executive sessions that approved contracts without member notice. Jess found 3 irregularities in the way fines were posted that made her mutter, "That's not how math even works." We hired an auditor who didn't play golf with anyone's husband. It cost money. It also cost time, and the kind of patience I didn't know I had. While we waited, we dealt with the normal stuff of communal living. The pool pump broke and had to be replaced. A coyote was spotted walking past the toddler playground like he had an opinion about the slides. Somebody's kid drew chalk on the sidewalk and someone else wrote, A letter about how chalk is graffiti and a gateway to property degradation. We sent out a newsletter that said, with heroic restraint, please be neighborly, and I tended my sunflowers. The fines had stopped. There wasn't a letter to rescind them. There was just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone in a room knows they've been playing a game with rules. The person running it made up as she went along, and someone unplugged the console. The audit came back like a thunderstorm first, heavy air, then rolling rumble, then the crack of lightning. It found overbilling by Cactus Crown. It found undisclosed conflicts of interest. It found self-dealing that made the accountant's eyebrows climb and not come back down. It found enough that when we turned it over to the state's community association regulator, I slept without white-knuckling it for the first time in months. The regulator did what regulators do. They took too long. Meanwhile, we did what neighbors do when they're not at war. We borrowed ladders and watched each other's kids and traded banana bread for tamales. I learned how to use the pool net. Lou taught me which cactus you can actually touch. Marcus's toddler learned to say my name like it had 4 syllables. In late spring, the letter came. It was from the state, not a printer that had been fighting at the SARS, but one who had finally found it. It said fines had been levied against Nancy for violating conflict of interest rules. It said Desert Ridge had been warned and placed on a watch. It said our auditor's findings were being forwarded to the county attorney for review. I took the letter to my porch and sat with it, and with the bees, and with the hum of an air conditioner 3 doors down. I took a picture of the sunflowers and sent it to the group chat. The captions came in. A flood of GIFs. Then, from Lou, simply, nice work, kid. I'm 32. I cried anyway. I didn't see Nancy again until July. It was a Saturday, the kind that is more sun than day. I was carrying bags of groceries to my door when she walked down the sidewalk. Her hair tucked under a hat, sunglasses on, a tight line where a mouth should be. She looked smaller. I don't mean skinnier. I mean like someone had let the air out a little. She saw me and paused. For a second, we just stood there, 2 women on a bright street, sweat between our shoulder blades, the smell of hot creosote, like an old memory. You got what you wanted, she said finally. I thought about what I'd wanted when this started. To be left alone, to keep my flowers, to not have to fight. I thought about what I'd gotten, more friends than I'd had in years, a crash course in governance, a sense that instead of living in a row of connected boxes, we lived in a place. I wanted fairness, I said. It sounded prissy. I winced. I wanted the rules to mean something besides whatever you said they meant. She adjusted her hat. You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself, I said, and then wished I hadn't. But it was true, and truth is like that sometimes. It leaves a bruise on both people. She looked down at the heat-shimmering sidewalk. My sister needed the work, she said. She's been struggling. You could have told us, I said. You could have made a case. They would have said no, she said. And I thought we had finally hit something real. The thing, under the thing, Nancy had always seemed like a person who needed control the way plants need sun. But maybe what she actually needed was to not be told no. Maybe somewhere along the way the line between helping people you love and helping yourself had blurred, and by the time she realized, the rest was momentum. One more contract, one more excuse, one more gavel tap. I hope your sister's okay, I said. She will be, she said. Not that it's your business. The old Nancy flared up and then subsided, like a campfire when someone kicks a log. She walked away, shoulders squared. I watched her go and felt his satisfaction. Not the ugly, bitter kind. The grounded kind. The kind that comes when a weight shifts and the floor of your life levels out. In August, we held our first actual election. We printed ballots and rented an ice cream truck and turned it into a block party disguised as democracy. Kids ran through sprinklers. Lou grilled. Evan took questions like a radio host. Jess handed out popsicles and told people which forms to sign. Yvonne stood at a table and, with a patience I want carved into my headstone, explained the budget and why our dues would be going up by $5 a month to pay for a new pool fence. People nodded, people argued, people voted. We counted, under the fairy lights strung from one tree to another. When we announced the results, there were cheers. And one toddler who cried because the balloon he'd been promised 20 minutes earlier had not materialized. We found him a balloon. He forgot why he was mad. In September, the sunflowers died. They do that. They are dramatic like that. One day they are a festival. The next, they are bowed heads and brittle leaves, hard centers pecked by birds. I cut them down and saved some seeds in a jar for next spring. I swept the steps. I sat where I always sit in the evening and watched the light change on the stucco and tried to match names to dogs as people walked past. Marcus came by with his daughter on his shoulders. She says flower house, he told me. Even when there are no flowers, I should change the sign, I said, pointing to the house number. Make it official, he laughed. We should change all the signs, make it a little less beige. We did, eventually, metaphorically and literally. We put in new pool chairs that weren't beige. We planted a couple of desert willows that throw pink shade in spring. We started a lending library. Jess set up CPR classes at the clubhouse. It wasn't a fairy tale. We still had arguments about trash can timing and holiday lights and whether a particular Halloween skeleton was lifelike, but even the arguments felt different. They were between people who saw each other at the mailbox and said hi. That's a kind of revenge. 2. Refusing to let pettiness shrink your life. The state finished whatever it was doing by Christmas. There were fines. There was a formal finding that conflicts had been handled improperly. There was an order to reimburse the association some of the money. There was the odd, bureaucratic phrase, lessons learned. There was an agreement that Nancy would not serve on the board again. The management company bowed out before we could fire them. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my porch and listened to fireworks pop and heard Leela's laugh in my head, not because she was in the sky, but because she was in everything I had kept alive in myself when I could have pulled it up by the roots. I raised a glass, not to victory over a person, but to a thing that's easy to joke about and hard to build, community. In the spring, the sunflowers bloomed again. Neighbors wandered by with dogs and strollers and coffee. Marcus's girl, taller, now, wrapped her arms around my leg and looked up at the flowers like they were an unbelievable rumor the world had told and then made good on. Lou took off his hat and scratched his head and said, "You going to plant tomatoes? You going to eat them?" I said. He grinned, "Only if you give me salt." Evan walked past with his husband, both of them waving. Jess texted me a photo of her cat trying to eat a sunflower leaf and a caption, "He thinks he's a rabbit." Yvonne emailed a draft budget with a note, "Tell me if I've made it too optimistic." I looked at the flowers, at the bees and the sky and the small, ordinary miracle of living beside people who share a fence and a street and enough of a story to know when to show up. I thought about revenge, how we talk about it like a movie, a one-liner, a gavel slam. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it looks like this, making the rules mean something, planting something stubborn and bright and refusing to pretend it doesn't matter that it's there. The letter gave me 10 days to erase my sister. It turned out to be the starting gun for bringing her back, not just in the petals and the seeds, but in meet the part that says, stand up, ask, don't accept. That's just how it is, when you can hear your heart beating, a different rhythm. She would have liked the party we threw in August. She would have danced under the fairy lights. She would have loved Lou. She would have, I hope, loved who I became when I realized I couldn't love what I'd planted if I didn't also love the ground it grew in. The last bloom opened on a Tuesday. It had been wrapped tight for days, and then suddenly it was itself. That evening, I got a piece of mail, this time with my name in a font that looked like it had practiced before it left the envelope. It was a notice of the annual meeting. The agenda included board election, budget approval, community garden proposal, and homeowner comments. I laughed until I had to put a hand on the railing to steady myself. Then I went inside, got a Sharpie, and made a sign for the little patch by my steps. It said, in simple black letters, take a seed, plant it somewhere that needs it.